on.
Okay. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program at Columbia University. And tonight we're starting a little later than normal because our very brave speaker is starting much earlier than normal because he is in Malaysia and he gets the Hero Award from the China and the World program for his steadfast willingness to give a talk at 6 a.m. in Malaysia. And he is a very special guest. Some of you will recall that he was a fellow in the program when the program was at Princeton, and he is Cheng-Chwee Kuik, and he is an associate professor and the director of the Center for Asian Studies at the National University of Malaysia. And Cheng-Chwee is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom about China's foreign relations with a multitude of countries in Asia. And he has the real distinction of helping us understand as outsiders from the region that all the different countries in Southeast Asia in particular have their own strategies toward mainland China, and China has its own strategy toward them, because concepts such as hedging, which are used often in discussions of what the Southeast Asian states must do in dealing with the United States and China, are often used very abstractly and without much distinction, as if all the countries are in the same position. They're all hedging between China and the United States. And what Cheng-Chwee's done in his research is really make it clear that there are very, very different hedging strategies in each of the 10 ASEAN states and in other countries in Asia outside of ASEAN. And he explores the differences between them in very useful ways. He also is interested in China's infrastructure projects in East Asia and in Asia more generally. And he just co-authored an excellent book with his PhD thesis advisor, Michael Lampton, David Lampton, at Johns Hopkins University, where Cheng-Chwee got his PhD. And that book is called Rivers of Iron, and it's all about China's railroad building in Southeast Asia, which is a big source of Chinese influence these days as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I don't want to say too much more about Cheng-Chwee, which I could do, but I want to give him plenty of time for his talk. And I'm glad to see old friends here. I didn't realize we were live before, but I see that old friends of the program, TK Chu and Li Xiaolin are on the line. And I look forward to an excellent talk and a lively Q&A period to follow. Welcome back, Cheng-Chwee. It's great to see a great scholar and an old friend of the program back here.
Thanks very much, Tom, for your kind introduction and also a very kind invite for having me here. And special thanks also to Daniel, who made all the thoughtful arrangement. And let me wish everybody who are sitting in front of your own screen, good evening, good afternoon, and also good morning, depending on where you are. I guess this is part of the new norm these days when we begin to give presentation in front of our little screen. Let me now share my PowerPoint. All right, I hope everybody can see the slides. And very glad to be back to CWP China and the World program again, although virtually. I spent a fantastic 1 year in CWP back in 2013, 2014. Thanks very much to Tom's great mentorship and also a wonderful guidance. So after that wonderful intellectually stimulating a year, I got back to Malaysia, resumed my teaching and also research position in National University of Malaysia, UKM. And there was a time that I started to involve in a number of multiple year projects, very much with what I have learned from CWP in mind. So I would share two of those multi-year projects here for this talk. And instead of discussing the projects one by one, I thought what I'm going to do for the purpose of this talk is to highlight a number of key themes and also central ideas connecting the two projects. And here I got the 3 points for today, 3 A's: asymmetry, authority, and also agency of smaller states. And with my rather strong Malaysian accent, I guess you all can expect I'm going to present not only a Malaysian perspective, but also a Southeast Asian perspective or smaller states perspective of how smaller countries in Southeast Asia see and look into not only about the Belt and Road, China's Belt and Road Initiative, but very much about the big power-backed infrastructure corporation, which clearly is not a business of China today, because a few days ago we knew that President Biden, for example, has kind of declared that US and also allies and partners are going to compete with China on a similar infrastructure cooperation. So with that backdrop, let me show you the two projects that I'm going to focus on for today. So on the left, as Tom very kind to introduce, it's about a co-authored project with my former teacher, Mike Lampton, and also a NUS colleague, Selina. So three of us spent a number of years, actually 4 or 5 years, on this particular project, focusing on how China promote the railroad projects in different parts of Southeast Asia. Very much that related to the so-called Singapore-Kunming rail link that many people remember. I will come to that a bit later on. And the second project, which it's interrelated, but it is kind of different from the first project in a number of ways. But let me talk about some similarities first before I talk about the differences. The similarity, of course, is that this second project, special issue project on Southeast Asian responses to China's Belt and Road, it's also about China-Southeast Asia interaction. It is also about Belt and Road related, but the difference between the second and also the first project is that instead of focusing on railroad projects, the second project focused on all kind of infrastructure projects that are related to Belt and Road. And the other difference is also instead of a co-authored volume, for this one, we actually involve a team of primarily Southeast Asian or Southeast Asia-based researchers covering all 10 ASEAN countries and look into comparing and also analyzing how and why different ASEAN countries, similarly situated smaller states, have responded to China's Belt and Road differently. China push, but smaller countries react in very different way. So you could see the list on the right. It's going to 8 out of the 10, 11 articles are going to be published actually in a few weeks' time, next month, by Asian perspective. So we have a theoretical chapter and also have individual country chapters or country papers. And the remaining 3 will be coming up in the same journal later this year. And I would also like to say that this journal output is also going to be a memorial tribute to late Professor Eileen Bavira, who passed away a year ago because of COVID, complication of COVID. And she actually contributed a Philippine chapter together with her co-author, Aris Rogai. So we are also very appreciative. Both projects are funded. The first one funded by Smith Richardson Foundation, and the second one funded by British Academy and Academy of Science Malaysia. We are grateful for their very generous support. So with that backdrop, let me share with you a map of Southeast Asia. As I mentioned, we have 10 ASEAN countries, but I'm not going to cover all 10 ASEAN countries. For the purpose of this discussion, I thought I would mainly focus on 3 representative countries, Laos, Malaysia, and Thailand. And whenever possible, wherever necessary, I'm going to bring in perhaps other cases as a comparison. For example, Vietnam, very close to China, but we know that very little really is going on about Belt and Road in Vietnam. So there is a sharp contrast to what is going on in, say, Laos, Malaysia, and Thailand. You could see from all the boxes in different colors representing different projects in different countries, a lot of things are ongoing. So I thought focusing on these 3 countries would give an interesting set of examples to illustrate the very diverse responses on the part of smaller countries. And another reason of focusing on these 3 countries also, you could see the map, especially the thick line here. There are 3 thick lines, right? One in Laos. Here you would see that there is all the thick lines are referring to the China-backed railroad. So as we talk, the construction are still ongoing, connecting for the rail line, high-speed rail, connecting Bataan and also Vientiane, Laos, the capital, and it's expected to be completed end of this year. So meaning that we are going to see it happen very soon, and that's going to be the first China-built high-speed rail in Southeast Asia, and it's also going to be the first connecting Southeast Asia directly into China's own HSR network. And the other one on Thailand is Bangkok Nong Khai. You could see the dotted line here. This is the second phase, which is still under negotiation. So meaning that despite the very close relationship between Thailand and China, Thailand has been very cautious. Unlike Laos, is very receptive. And what is going on as we talk, it's only the first phase, Bangkok to Nakhon Ratchasima, which is called as Korat. And as we talked just yesterday, a few hours ago, 3 new contracts was given about this phase 1. And further south, the Malaysia part is the so-called East Coast Railing here, connecting the east coast of Malaysia right here to Port Klang on the west coast of Malaysia. And all these countries are important, interesting, because of it is between the two oceans of the Indian Ocean and also the Pacific Ocean. And China is having a lot of reasons for pushing this. One of the many reasons is about energy insecurity. We talk about Malacca dilemma. So there have been talks about East Coast Railing. It's not just about rail project, but it's also going to be a land bridge connecting 2 ports on the other parts of 2 oceans. And China is also planning something similar about the Kra. It used to be like Kra Canal, but now looks like the new plan is instead of canal, is going to be a land bridge connecting different parts of Thailand. So we'll come to all these details later on, but this is just to give some overview of the complexity and also the dynamic of the subject matter that we talk about. Almost every day, there are some new developments ongoing in different parts of the region and also different kind of projects. So this is a structure for my talk. The remaining time, having shared about the 2 projects, I'm going to highlight mainly the agency and also asymmetry authority. So by here, you could see that agency, by highlighting the variations of Southeast Asian responses, this is going to be my dependent variable, the focus of my analysis. And the other 2 A's, asymmetry and authority, they are my explanatory variables. Asymmetry or power asymmetry, the power gap between China and Southeast Asia, this is a given structural condition. It is being filtered through the domestic variable of authority, which is an intervening variable here. And it is domestic authority, the internal variable that filter either playing up or playing down the structural effects of Chinese power, resulting in different forms of responses, different degree and different manifestation of agency on the part of smaller countries. And this is my overall argument. And first thing first, let's talk about agency before we talk about asymmetry and also authority. So different scholars, different political scientists or our specialists will define agency quite differently, I guess. So here for our project, we define agency as capacity of unit level actors, in this case, smaller countries, to preserve and translate our own preferences to some preferred outcome, despite the power gap that we're facing when faced with China or any other big powers. And some might be wondering, why talk about smaller countries? Isn't world politics dominated by big powers? And we also realize that when we talk about Belt and Road, many researchers or experts or observers have been relating the notion of that trap with Belt and Road. And we in Southeast Asia, clearly we have reservations about that notion for various reasons. But one reason is that the notion of that trap kind of implies that smaller countries are not only powerless, they are clueless, they are very kind of reactive, and they couldn't do anything but being pushed around and trapped into that issue that perpetrated by big powers. And during our fieldwork, we have come to a conclusion, some are clearer than others, that when big powers push like China would push the Belt and Road projects, small countries sometimes pulls. And small countries pull China in before even Belt and Road initiative. So a lot of projects actually took place while before even Xi Jinping, while before Belt and Road. So there are a lot of indicators that it's not necessarily China push and create a threat. That's not the case. It's smaller countries have the demand, and they see China as an opportunity in one way or another. And then we see, I do not want to bore you with details. I think it's suffice to say that when we talk about agency or different patterns of agencies, we could safely identify that there are some variations. And these are the 4 variations that I thought is very clear coming up from the case of Southeast Asia, which I think should be applicable and parallel to countries outside of the region. So the first one is, I've just mentioned, proactive initiation. So small countries actually take the initiative to tell China that let's collaborate on this and that. And then China was reactive very positively. So that's the first type of agency or small state agency. The second type is, yes, China proposed and smaller countries choose. They make a choice. They are not being forced, but they make a choice of participate actively for some desired or targeted mutual benefits. And the third one is that agency doesn't necessarily have to be proactive and active. It can be passive as well. So in the case of Vietnam, you see that Vietnam takes the choice of passively keep a distance from China. China push, but the only China-related, China-backed infrastructure projects in Vietnam is actually the intra-city rail in Hanoi, and there are lots of like problems and also deferment. And high-speed rail projects, they have been talking about for more than 10 years, nothing really happened. And that's a sharp contrast to things that happen in Laos, in Thailand, and also Malaysia. Finally, you have, I thought it's very interesting and relatively recent, you have some kind of renegotiation. Smaller countries, despite being disadvantageous position, we try to renegotiate with China certain terms we don't like. And the best example I thought is Mahathir 2.0. Malaysia's case on East Coast Railing, that when Mahathir came back to power in May 2018, one of the first things that he did was to suspend 3 China-related infrastructure projects. The most important one is East Coast Railing. And empirical cases, our research indicates that he had no confidence whether the renegotiation would be agreeable by China or would be successful. But eventually China agreed, and the renegotiation was successfully concluded 8 months, 9 months later in April 2019. So depending on the Q&A, we might get back to this. But I'm sharing all this just to illustrate the nuanced differences and also a nuanced form of small state agency. It's a very simple word, but I think in reality, you see various forms. And there are reasons. There are reasons that why this is so. And clearly there are internal and external reasons. And here, so you see that the cat is out of the bag. So the question, the research question that we have here by now is that why do similarly situated smaller states demonstrate different forms of agency and responses vis-a-vis the big power-backed infrastructure projects? So here, just to share some pictures that we took during our fieldwork, I think Tom and Daniel are smiling because of they see the familiar face of Mike Lampton. And Selina, who was also there. So those are the pictures that we took in various parts of Southeast Asia. You could see the one upper left, it's the one in Boten. Boten is a small town bordering Laos and also northern Laos and China. So it's from there that the Lao-China high-speed rail is going to be connected to Mohan in Kunming, southern China. And then this is a huge construction that in Udomsai, a small town near Boten. And as we visited, that was actually 2017, and that was 1 year after the groundbreaking ceremony was launched. And it looks like, although it took 6 years for Laos and socialist authoritarian country to make a decision, but once the decision was made by December 2016, and that was a Christmas day, the construction, the implementation has been relatively smooth. Perhaps because of being authoritarian country, there is very little bottom-up dynamics to constrain what the elites have made. And this is very different from, say, in Thailand and also in Malaysia, where bottom-up dynamics, clearly inter-elite competition also play a part in kind of disrupting or delaying or complicating either the negotiation process or implementation process. So here on the right side, you would see a station called Kleng Dong, which is in Pak Chong or the Korat area. And Korat is interesting because of it is the gateway from Bangkok into the northeast region of Isan. So we actually spent one of the summers traveling on ground with the help of Thai friends who could do the translation for us in Thailand and also in Laos. Only during the field work, we actually kind of realized that all this while we thought that there is only one type of railroad happening on all these countries, which is a China back, but actually no. In northeast region, Isan, in fact, Thailand is constructing already their own double track conventional railroad, which is a meter gauge. The one that pushed by China is a standard gauge, and standard gauge would mean 1.435. So we were told, we understand from the interaction with those on ground, including some train station managers, actually there was some space being kept in the dual track construction in the northeast region, Isan in Thailand, meaning that even though the negotiation is still ongoing, Thailand actually went ahead with their own plan, but they're having reservation about the HSR version, which is much more expensive, and clearly there are financial issues. And for that's phase 2, right? And phase 1, Thailand under even Prayut, a military leader who actually need China's support externally, have also adopted a selective and cautious approach. And we thought that is very interesting. And that brings us to the final example that I have here. CECRL, East Coast Railing Project in Malaysia. So that's the time that we visited in 2018, late 2018. Mahathir just got back to power, and then it was still suspended, but we managed to at least take some photo rather than look at what is going on. But this is Section 7, which is in Bentong. And again, this is an interesting place because of different successive governments in Malaysia have taken very different approach to the construction of Section C. Depending on time later on, I might get back to this issue. So the examples here again show that all these projects are very dynamic. There is no one single country, not China, not even the government of the day, could really kind of say that this is the direction that we are going, and that's it. Very limited country, perhaps to some extent Laos, because of the political system, they are able to do that. To some extent, maybe Cambodia belong to the same category. But for many other countries, things are much more complicated and dynamic than we see. So here, let me show you one more slide before I move on to asymmetry and also authority real briefly. So let's use some of the quotes and also I thought the very important insights for us to understand small state agency and how small countries in the region and also outside the region see all these infrastructure projects. I think many of us would see railroad like it is just one of the infrastructure projects. It is just development issue. But small countries in the region and elsewhere actually see that it's much more than that. It is not just a development economic issue, it's a political governance issues and even survival issue. And some countries are much more than that. Like for example, Laos, we talked to many hundreds of respondents and I've got thousands of quotes and all that. So I have 3 quotes here, I thought very representative. The second and third one are from former leader, right? Mahathir at that time, he was in full retirement. Perhaps he didn't expect they will get back to power. So he shared with us a lot of interesting ideas. And the third one is Abhisit, the former Thai prime minister, who also played a part, make the first move to engage China, talking about the possible high-speed rail. But the best quote is actually from official level personnel in Laos. So thanks to some friends, we are able to get access to some of the officials and also policymakers. So one meeting in Vientiane, a Lao official, said something along this line. Because when we asked them very provocatively, why despite all the big financial burden, because the loan would be roughly about half of Laos GDP, why with all the big costs and also potential risks, Laos still decided to go ahead with this controversial project? He didn't talk much, but he gave a very straight point in a very straightforward way. He said, Laos see rail as much more than an infrastructure project. He said other countries, civilizations had rivers for transport. Laos is a landlocked country. It's the only landlocked country in Southeast Asia. And Laos see a railroad, the one that backed by China, as an iron river. And a railroad is an iron river for Laos, a landlocked country. They will connect to civilizations, more developed markets, larger markets, not just in southern China, but also other parts of Southeast Asia. So I think might being might. Right after that meeting and interview, he looked at Selina and myself. He said, we got the title for our book. And that's how A River of Iron came about, and which is something that it was acknowledged in our preface of the book. So then let me briefly share about Mahathir and also Abhisit's remarks because of they are very telling about and also clarifying a number of misconceptions about what is going on in Southeast Asia when it comes to Belt and Road and all that. Most people think that Singapore-Kunming rail link, because of connecting Kunming and southern China, is a Chinese initiative. China pushed for it. It's true that China today pushed for SKRL, high-speed rail version, but a clarification is that this original project proposal is nothing to do with China. It's actually a proposal on the part of Southeast Asia. Mahathir proposed that in 1995 during the ASEAN meeting. And then what he had in mind, and given the technological level at that time, we did not have a high-speed rail version in mind. It's only a conventional rail version. And Mahathir told us, because he was the one who proposed that. So Mike and I, we got a chance to visit him in Putrajaya, and then he reflected. He spent an hour with us, telling us, recalling his decision. He said that the Singapore-Kunming rail link is not to construct a new rail link. It's not, because we already have a conventional railroad here and there. What you need is just to build the connectivity, meaning that you need to fill in the missing links. So SKRL in ASEAN, Mahathir's version, is really a conventional one, and is to not to construct a new rail, but to connect or construct the railroad network, that to connect the missing links, to also build some spur lines, important parts of the countries, and also to convert the single track to a double tracking project that is going on, the one in Isan and also various parts of the region. So he started that. He did not just put forward a proposal. Following year, he actually institutionalized it into an interstate mechanism, including China. And so that it was not China pushed the envelope. It was smaller countries took the initiative, recognizing the importance of China and bring China in. And China is going through some kind of learning process. And when conditions were ripe technologically and financially, China now begin to push their own version. And SKRL, and these are the things that we discussed in chapter 7 of the book of the River of Iron book. We elaborated that the importance of talking about ASEAN version of SKRL is that 20 over years after the proposal, we still did not see much of SKRL really happening. And that shows the inadequacy and limitation on the part of smaller countries on our own. We couldn't do that. And we look around Bretton Woods institutions or ADB and all that, not much resources are coming here. So Belt and Road Chinese push provided the kind of things that we want, and we also demand that is critical, not just economically, but also politically. Same rationale for Thailand and other countries. So Abhisit was the one who made visit to China, talking to China's side back in 2009. But because of Thailand's own political problems, these things have been dragging on. But even back in 2009 here, Thailand already saw the technological and also financial power of China. And that's before the rise of Xi Jinping, the rise of Belt and Road that we see. So now let me, having elaborated the variations, the nuances, and also differences of small state agency and Southeast Asian responses to Belt and Road, let me provide some explanation, and let me begin with asymmetry before I move on to talk about authority. So asymmetry, as I defined earlier on, can be simply put as a power gap or disparity in capability between sovereign states, and this is kind of a given structural conditions for all small countries and also China. What is interesting, and this is something that Tom alluded earlier on, Southeast Asia-China relations is not just about our relationship with China. Other big powers, primarily United States and other big powers as well, are involved. So we are not talking about just one set of power asymmetry. We are talking about power asymmetries. We are talking about rivalries because it's in the DNA of big powers to compete themselves. Things never change, right? They just changing names and also faces of big powers. And we in Southeast Asia know that long ago. Southeast Asia's history is a history of great power politics. And I'm from Malaysia. Malaysia is kind of the lucky one, quote unquote. Western colonization began in this place. And we went through not just one colonization, we went through three. So started from Portuguese, Dutch, and then British, and then even Japan, and today US, China. So nothing new. It's a constant, it's the structural conditions, and there are uncertainties about that. So it might be, I'm not saying that it's all about bad and negative aspects, things go both ways. So with the Quad and US and Japan all declared and try to push forward their own version of Belt and Road, to some extent, this is a good news to smaller countries in the region because it might provide. At the moment, not really there yet, but I think this is a right step in the long-term direction, in the sense that the more the merrier. So some competition is there as long as we don't cross into what Tom has described as a red line, right? No Cold War. As long as no Cold War, then I think some competition is actually good. And my key point here is that because of asymmetry, inevitably all power asymmetry will be marked by two effects, which is apprehensions and attractions. I don't think it's a simple, straightforward thing that when you face with a big guy, you would all be worried and anxiety, or you will all be attracted. Things come both, it's a package, right? But it all evolve and also dynamic depending on the bilateral interaction and depending on the power structure of the day. But here, our project, especially the second project, the Asian Perspective Special Asia project, indicates that asymmetry is important, very fundamental, but it has no inherent logic, meaning that you cannot say that because of power asymmetry, small countries will all be worried or fearful of China and keep distance. You cannot also say that because of China's growing power, all are attracted to China and bandwagon with China in one way or another. In real terms, I think the reality is much more complicated and nuanced. You get a bit of both, but in different combination, different degree, and different implications. And that's why IR specialists in the region won't be jobless, because of we would have a lot of things to do and tasks to do in order to explain why so. Why some countries are more attracted to China, and why some countries decided to play up and play down the so-called China's rise or the so-called China threat perception. So here, again, is my last slide for asymmetry, is that very simple. We can remember and bear in mind that there is one asymmetry, one power, one Belt and Road, but there are many responses. And this is an important point that we need to bear in mind to indicate that although power asymmetry is there, smaller countries always have a space and also agency to see what does asymmetry mean and how to respond to it. So here I group the patterns of interactions and also small state responses into three. Although I said that our cases are about 10 ASEAN countries, but I learned from my teachers, my mentor like Tom, that it would be terrible if I talk about 10 countries, I have 10 patterns, right? There will be a terrible and no generalization. So we learned from CWP training that we need to group that. So there are three big categories that would capture 10 ASEAN countries, and all 10 ASEAN countries are not static. Come a leader, different leaders, the pattern might change. So here, the three main patterns and three main variations, I would group them as three sets of LA, limiting asymmetry, keep the distance, like Vietnam, but to some extent also Philippines under Aquino before Duterte, the current leadership, and also Myanmar before Aung San Suu Kyi. Also, if those of you who remember Bak Mit Son, then he was the one authoritarian leader, decided to actually suspend the China pet project in Myanmar, so limiting asymmetry, keep distance. And second category is living with asymmetry. Asymmetry is there, you cannot avoid it. You have to live with it, but you reacted the partner and choose to collaborate with it selectively and also gradually. So there are two important examples to illustrate that, which is continue to be so as of we speak now, which is Indonesia under Jokowi, and also Thailand, interestingly, under Prayut, military leader, despite the very limited election and all that. And we all know that because of Western isolation and condemn and all that, Thailand under Prayut has been moving very closely with China, and seems like little Thailand needs China. And that is very telling. But even that, or precisely because of the perceived dependency, Thailand under Prayut insists to respond to China's Belt and Road in a very limited, gradually aspect, selectively. It's a big contrast to what is going on in Malaysia, for example. And there are internal legitimation reasons that I'm going to elaborate a bit later on. So the third pattern is leveraging. So we see asymmetry is there, and we cannot change it, you cannot stop it. You'll be silly to ignore it. And hence, we have decided, let's embrace, let's leverage it for domestic reason. And it leads to one thing, right? All elites, regardless of the political system and all that, elites, the DNA is that we want to continue to rule. And you want to continue to rule by different pathway of legitimation. So we saw Belt and Road China partnership provided some opportunities. So you see that a long list of Southeast Asian countries have decided to embrace Belt and Road to a large extent, different ways, different format. For example, Singapore embrace and partner with Belt and Road, not by constructing infrastructure projects within their own country, but in China. So Singapore has the so-called Chongqing connectivity initiative, and it's going to be much more than bilateral. It's going to be regional because of it is connected to many other bigger infrastructure schemes. For example, the international sea and land corridor, so on and so forth. What is interesting to note before I move on to my final point about authority is that you look into the list of these countries under leveraging asymmetry. These are countries with different political systems. There are some democratic countries. There are authoritarian countries. There are countries of different developmental levels. Some are underdeveloped, so need China's Belt and Road. Some are actually relatively developed, but they still choose to collaborate with China. So all these empirical cases reality actually refute the wrong impression that those who are partnering with China on Belt and Road are countries of authoritarian and underdeveloped. I think this is wrong. This is only partially correct. In reality, things are much more complicated for a number of internal reasons that I shall elaborate. Finally, you also see the list that there are many countries who are actually the South China Sea claimant countries, Brunei, Malaysia, and Duterte's Philippines. And despite the territorial problems, we have decided that security, economic development-wise, we need to play a different game, which brings me to my final slide, authority. So again, authority can be defined very simply as ruling elites' quest for legitimacy and also capacity to govern at home. And the usual literature review indicates that scholars tend to group or create, I would call like a legitimacy black box, as if there is only one type of legitimacy or one pathway of a legitimacy. For example, some would argue that you have democracy, you have legitimacy. I think in reality, in Southeast Asia especially, I don't think that holds true. There are many sources of legitimacy. There are many pathways of legitimation. So democracy-based procedural legitimation is clearly one of it, an important one, especially say, for example, in Indonesia, after the new order. You could say that in the Philippines and also, of course, Myanmar before the current situation, Procedural legitimacy, very, very important. Even in Malaysia, a semi-quasi-democracy, procedural legitimation is also one of the reasons that push Mahathir 2.0, a strong leader, to renegotiate with China. And because of that popular mandate, it actually increased smaller countries' leverage to bargain with China. Look, it's not me, it's about my people. We just have to renegotiate. So that clearly is very important, but focusing primarily or solely on procedural legitimation won't help us to understand the complexity. There are different pathways that are either equally important or even more important. Performance legitimation, it's so important, and which is why I have decided that this is the first pathway to be displayed in this slide, because for all ASEAN countries, regardless of the political system, performance legitimation, primarily economic and developmental based performance, is critical. And this is so particularly for, say, small countries like PAP. Why PAP in Singapore has been able to rule the country from 1965, from day one until today. So performance is very, very important to cope with the vulnerability and all that. But it's not just about development and growth. In some countries, depending on the national issues, like Myanmar, for example, managing the ethnic minorities clearly is a big performance issue. Aung San Suu Kyi won public mandate, strong mandate during election. So procedural legitimation-wise, she had no problem. But she need to perform in economic way and also in managing the minority issue. And those are the issues that you cannot do anything without good, productive partnership with China, which is why she has been very pragmatic and also receptive about Belt and Road, resume and also engage some partnership with China. So the last pathway that I would like to elaborate is about the particularistic legitimation. It's identity-based, which is very different from performance procedural. This can take the form of anti-China nationalism, for example. It can take the form of some Thai identity. So that particular legitimation explains why Vietnam, despite the fact that Vietnam also needs a performance legitimation. But because of anti-China nationalism, a big source of particularistic legitimation, Vietnam communist leaders cannot go too far in collaborating with China. And hence, this source of legitimacy kind of offset the importance of performance legitimation. So it makes more sense politically for Vietnam to keep a distance from China and Belt and Road. Similarly, but to a lesser degree, Thailand's private government, precisely because of his regime, needs China and being perceived as dependent on China. But for Thai identity politics, he needs to choose and selectively collaborate, because otherwise he will be accused even further that he's selling Thai's interests. So during the negotiation, for example, especially for phase 2, when China put forward its own envelope, Thai officials and elites will tell Chinese officials, this is Thailand. We do things in Thai way, not Chinese way. So they were very upset when China put forward some documents all in Chinese, right? So Thai did not like it. And Thai would also very interestingly, during our fieldwork, they would insist that some projects, there are not Belt and Road projects. There are Thai projects. China is only one of the partners. For example, what is going on in EEC, Eastern Economic Corridor. So China is one partner together with CP Group, the largest Thai business group. And Thai elites insist not to call EEC as a Belt and Road projects, but a Thai project. So finally, to sum up, I want to show this diagram, which some of you might have seen it from the book. So this is a 2x2 matrix that sum up my discussion about how domestic politics play a big part in explaining why different smaller countries have responded differently, how and why they have demonstrated different forms and different degree of agency. Some are more successful than the others. So in addition to the legitimation that I have highlighted and spent about 5-10 minutes, there is another internal variable. I think when Tom looked at this, he would notice that this is very Mike Lampton, right? So Mike, through his earlier works, emphasized about pluralization as a factor in explaining China. So now we are applying that variable, power pluralization, to what extent it is concentrated or decentralized among elites or between state and society into the case of Southeast Asia. So that explains why authoritarian countries like Laos and Vietnam have responded differently in the sense that because of the particularistic legitimation, right? So anti-China sentiment limited Vietnam. Although Vietnam also won development, but because of that different sources of legitimation, Vietnam kept the distance. But this particular pluralization is the more important variable that explains why Malaysia and Laos both want to be receptive about China's partnership for domestic elites' benefits, but Malaysia is more fluctuating. There is a recalibration. Whenever there is a change of government, there will be some changes. And this is true, I would say that also for Myanmar. We have seen before Aung San Suu Kyi and now after Aung San Suu Kyi, you see some differences. And I would say perhaps the same can be said about Philippines. Once Duterte is gone, perhaps we might see some fluctuating situation. And this is to a large extent not just about legitimation, but about the degree of power pluralization in the sense that there are some inter-elite competition, then also there are bottom-up dynamics that would constrain the extent to which ruling elites would and could collaborate with China and also embrace a Belt and Road. And with that, I would end my presentation. Back to you, Tom.
Oh, thanks so much, Cheng-Chwee. I learned a tremendous amount, and we recommend that people put their questions on the Q&A, but I'm going to ask a few up front. I'm just so fascinated by the topic, and I thought a lot about it, and I don't know what to think about it because it's so complicated, and you make a lot of things clear. One question is a very abstract question, the first one, which is, you talked about how a lot of these railroad ideas predated the Belt and Road Initiative. And we had a speaker at Columbia a couple of years ago, back when you could have a speaker at Columbia, named Oliver Stunkel, who was a Latin American expert on, he's from Brazil, on China's foreign policy. And he said a lot of the Latin American infrastructure projects were conceived before the Belt and Road, and then later became part of the Belt and Road. And we had Erica Downs speak in the program, and she's an expert on Chinese energy policy, both at home and abroad. And she talked about the biggest part of the Belt and Road, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And she said, well, that predated the Belt and Road, and then the Belt and Road enveloped that project. I guess my abstract question, I've asked this before, maybe 3-4 years ago back in Princeton. How much of the details of the Belt and Road would have occurred if there was no Belt and Road Initiative? If it was just, normal economic relations between China and its neighbors, with China being an infrastructure powerhouse and these neighbors needing infrastructure. And how much of it is driven by the fact that Xi Jinping made this big announcement that he was going to launch a Belt and Road and make it his signature project? And I always wondered, like, would this just have happened anyway in many cases? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, what is the nature of the Chinese not monopoly, but stronghold in this field? Is it that they're just very good at building infrastructure? We know Japan is very good at building infrastructure, and Japan does compete in some places like Indonesia. Japan built the Jakarta subway, and then China is building the Bandung-Jakarta railway. Japan has built in the continental Southeast Asia as well, some of the rail systems. So will Japan's response be effective? Because Japan seems more concerned even than the United States on the power level. And what's the best strategy for countries like Japan and the United States? Japan seems willing to even cooperate with China in places like India on projects. Do you think Japan will cooperate with China in Southeast Asia or just compete? And why isn't the ADB more involved? That's a multilateral institution. You had said it just hasn't been that involved, but it seems like a good design for that. And then the last question is really about power. How does this railroad building give China power? Is it that they control the railroads, or they gain influence by building the railroads themselves? Is it that the railroads facilitate trade and therefore more economic dependence on China through the trade that flows on the railroads? Or is it the one issue that you didn't talk about, which is debt? Americans focus on debt. I think they focus on debt excessively, but Americans focus on debt and the so-called debt trap. You know, I've written about it. You know, I'm not a big believer in the debt trap, but what is it about the rivers of iron that give China power? And why are Americans and Japanese just so concerned that China's going to build railroads in these countries? What power is it going to give over them? And how is it disadvantaged the United States and China?
Thank you, Tom. All three questions are great questions. And let me address that perhaps in reverse order. Because of your third question, clearly it's a touch upon the central argument of the River of Iron book, because we want to see precisely to what extent, in what way, what is going on about China-backed real projects in Southeast Asia, indicate to what extent China really has the power, intended power that it wants to have as a rising power. So our answer, this can take another 3 hours, I guess. But the short answer to that very important question is clearly that only to some extent. And in fact, the various examples that I shared earlier on, small state agency, precisely are empirical evidence that show, even though China would have a tendency and the relative strength to push, but sometimes it's very limited because smaller countries will always have a tendency and also reasons and also some leverage to push back, to renegotiate, and China might not like it, but they'll have to accept it. So the book really is not just to show about Chinese growing power. It also shows, even at the so-called backyard of China, Chinese power has limitations, and China would have to adapt to it. Sometimes to kind of counter with some suggestion. Sometimes they have to live with it. The Malaysia ECRL example that I mentioned briefly, Mahathir 2.0, is a clear good example. We knew that China was very reluctant to actually renegotiate or entertain these this request from a small country, and worrying that it's not so much about Beijing doesn't like Putrajaya, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, but because they knew that, they are worried. There are so many projects going on with some problems. If they agree to Malaysia's request to renegotiate, it might open a floodgate, right? But despite this kind of a tendency and calculation, Beijing, a powerful actor, China, still agreed to sit down and renegotiate, and actually agreed to a lot of things, make concession to a small country called Malaysia. So that show, I think that's a good example to answer your third question, which brings me to my second, your second question, Japan factor. Actually, Japan's role, it's well recognized and also elaborated in the book in chapter 7. When we talk about geoeconomic and also geopolitics, we actually spend a big chunk of pages to illustrate that Japan is actually not a newcomer. Japan is one of pioneering actors when it comes to developmental partners in Southeast Asia particularly. But there is a distinction as to Japan's involvement in this infrastructure chessboard before and after 2013. Before 2013, before Belt and Road, because of China, Japan's involvement was primarily driven by economic and to some extent geoeconomic, nothing geopolitics. But 2013 onwards, you would see that geopolitics become a more important driver, pushing Japan to do a lot of things. For example, 2015, Japan came out with the so-called Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. We in the region, we actually laugh about this terminology. We said Japanese is very naughty. It's like the word Partnership for Quality Infrastructure is like telling the region or the whole world that China's package is no quality or of lower quality. Right? So this is interesting, but anyhow, it's nothing new to Southeast Asia countries. We actually welcome that, seeing it as an alternative. For example, Thailand actually tried to leverage on it. You mentioned rightly, Tom, about Jakarta, Bandung. That's true. And in fact, even for Kuala Lumpur to Singapore high-speed rail, China make it a point that they wanted it. Japan from day one also make it very clear during Najib's time that they wanted it. So smaller countries welcome this kind of competition, yeah. But sometimes this competition might not necessarily resulted in the desired outcome because of big power might change their mind. For example, just now I mentioned briefly about Thailand, right? So during our fieldwork, we understand, and this is very much Thailand's DNA. Out of 10 ASEAN countries, Thailand is the only one that have never been colonized by any power. They have the skill. They are the natural hager, I would say. So they have a power balancing in their DNA. So during the fieldwork, it became clear that Thai elites, their grand kind of vision was that they collaborate with China, talking about the north-south rail road, right? Bangkok to Nong Khai. At the same time, they make sure that Japan is always in the picture. So they talk to Japan not only on a few projects, for example, the East-West line, right? And also the Bangkok-Chiang Mai. But unfortunately, after the feasibility study was done, Japan was the one, JICA decided after the feasibility study that the Bangkok Chiang Mai high-speed rail is not economically viable. So they have a second thought, and clearly Thai elites are kind of disappointed. And I think perhaps, I'm not quite sure, we need a new fieldwork. I think Thai elites perhaps are still trying to convince Japan to play some role. So these are just some examples to show that. Again, before I move on to your first question, is that what is interesting also is that Japan is not doing it just by themselves. They are in a way like holding the fort, but they are also trying to influence some like-minded countries as they push forward their own partnership for quality infrastructure. And they do it in a multi-layered way. They do it in a multi-layered way in the sense that they do multiple bilateral with Australia, with US, with India, but also trilateral, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, US, for example. And then interestingly, also at the Quad level. So it took a few years to see some development. 2018, it's a very important year when it comes to competition on the second chessboard, infrastructure particularly. 2018, you saw important actors that early on took the attitude that we don't do infrastructure, we don't play this game, began to take a different approach, right? US, for example, have the Build Act in 2018. So I think Biden's vision is very much on the basis of Build Act. And also the same year, EU came up with the EU-Asia connectivity strategy, also in 2018. And although they deny that this is like Europe's response to Belt and Road, but I think we all know what is happening, and smaller countries actually welcome that. As I said earlier on, the more the merrier. Then one more point before I move on is that, and that's interesting and also significant, that's why we are hopeful in the sense that China itself, by 2018, when they talk about the celebrated the 5th anniversary of Belt and Road, Xi Jinping himself talked about the so-called third country cooperation. I think, Tom, your earlier question was about that. So it was China who actually proposed. Perhaps they realized that financially it's not sustainable if it is just China and a different host country, right? You need to have third country or third party. Can be another country like India and Japan, and it can be another institution like AIIB and even ADB. I was involved in one project hosted by ADB about Belt and Road a few years ago, around the same time. So meaning that all these have been on table. And I do think that that is a good development when you have a different kind of third country cooperation. So meaning that, number one, no single power dominates anything. No kind of perceived dependency. So that's good financially, it's good politically. So ruling elites would not be accused by their own constituencies that, look, you put all eggs in certain powers basket, right? And you also help in terms of creating some form of interdependence, like your recent article talk about, interdependence in the sense that everyone have a stake in something. So we should find a solution to manage and also resolve some disagreement or even rivalry, right? So finally, your first question, I think to cut the long story short, we could say that China always have the tendency of like coming out with something grand and also a framework, right? And this have, I think your question actually revealed your answer already, Tom. I thought that when you mentioned about Xi Jinping's role to make it happen and to associate his own reputation with Belt and Road, so that clearly is for domestic reason, domestic consumption. You want to be a part of Xi Jinping's domestic legacy. So things that even though it's not part of, it was not part of Belt and Road, it predated the Belt and Road. But if you want to highlight how impactful and how significant Belt and Road, the initiative of the leader, you want also the more the merrier. So things that already happened and happened successfully, you want to group it as a Belt and Road initiative. And that reminds me of my final point, perhaps before we welcome other question would be, and that's the gray area on ground. Gray area on ground is that now it's 7-8 years after Belt and Road is being launched, but I think neither in China nor outside of China, I don't think anybody actually have a concrete consensual list of which projects are Belt and Road, which are not. Because for various reasons, on the part of China, I know that, for example, Malaysian government, even back in Najib's time, two governments before this, have been pushing and negotiating with China. Let's come up with something very concrete. Let's make it clear. What is Belt and Road? Let's come up with a list. What is Belt and Road and what is not? My response from my conversation with people in charge is that China kind of took a long time. And the reasons that that in the mind of most policy officials is that clearly on the part of China, I think there are some difficulties because of some are problematic. You do not want to put it as a Belt and Road. And also some are involving actors from the private sector in China. It's not about the government. So they will be reluctant to actually categorize them as a Belt and Road. And the other one is, of course, they're also worried that if they categorize some projects as Belt and Road, so smaller countries will have a different expectation, right? We might be even more bold and demanding in requesting that, hey, you want to make this as a success? Let's make some concession. So I think for practical reasons, there is a gray area. So sometimes I guess ambiguity is beauty or necessity in the real world.
Thanks so much, Cheng-Chwee. Daniel, can you handle the written questions? I just wanted to say that Sarah Sklar made an excellent point in the chat a second ago in response to my question, which is Minya's work is very good about the domestic sources of the Belt and Road and some of the domestic drivers that may have existed with or without the initiative to export excess capacity in the construction sector, et cetera. It's a very good book.
Right, that's right. Yeah, that reminds me, Tom, I think I overlooked one small part of your third question, which is about the debt trap, right?
Yeah, I was struck, because I think the debt trap is exaggerated at best if it's not totally cut from whole cloth. I think even in the case of Sri Lanka, it doesn't really hold up very well. But it's very common in American talks about the Belt and Road is the debt aspect. And I just noticed that in your talk, you basically didn't mention debt once.
Yeah, I mentioned that early on very briefly, you're right, by expressing my reservation because of that trap would imply that a small country, it's kind of clueless and powerless and all that, but small state agency show that actually the situation, the reality, it's much more complex than that. But there are other, but your question really is a very good one in the sense that it allows me and reminds me to also share other reasons why that trap notion might not be, it's too simple and simplistic notion in the sense that on ground, it also, whether it's debt trap or not, also depends on about the financing mode, because not all are involving loans. It's not all about debt. Some are actually investment and also partnership. For example, the one in, it's not much talk about outside of Malaysia, but in Malaysia, we know that this is actually perhaps the most important project that China will want to, has been also categorizing as a Belt and Road, is that the one in Kuantan. And Kuantan is very important because it's the biggest town in a city in east coast of Malaysia and relatively underdeveloped, but also because of the location. It is facing South China Sea, and it's a big port, and China kind of started to invest in Kuantan in multiple forms, well before Xi Jinping, well before Belt and Road. First, through the industrial park, and the other one, Kuantan China Industrial Park, and the other one is through the Kuantan port expansion. So it's an important dot in China's Belt and Road map, in the sense that I would say 10 years, 20 years down the road, you are going to see a relatively different geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape, in the sense that Kuantan's role will be very, very important, and it's being connected already with a sister industrial park and also sister port in China's Qingzhou in Guangxi. So those projects are not involving loan. It's investment and joint venture. And I would say that, and that brings me to another point, whether it's loan or investment is an important variable in refuting or proving that trap issue. And the other one is about the, we say the devil is in the detail, the partnership detail, whether it's a 70-30% partnership or 50-50. It's joint venture. If 80-20, it will be very different from, say, 50-50. So the one involving Kuantan, it's subnational actors and also G2G, it all involve 50-50, and it's joint development, joint venture investment. And I would think that, is this a debt trap? I certainly do not think so. So it actually also spilled over to many other projects. China's CRRC, for example, is investing, and that's investment. In the other part of Malaysia, in Batu Gajah, they call it as the rail locomotive factory. And the aim is to actually make Malaysia's Batu Gajah as a center to produce, manufacture, and export the train cars, locomotive, to all over Southeast Asia, because of this is the trend. Every ASEAN countries, almost every ASEAN countries are talking about high-speed rail. You need someone to produce the train. So Malaysia is being chosen, and all these are were happening before Belt and Road. And now it's being packaged to some extent to Belt and Road. But the point here is that all these empirical examples shows that that trap is too simple, too simplistic, and some Belt and Road projects are actually beneficial to local economy, national development. And those are good examples. Of course, ECRL is very problematic because of the 1MDB scandal, but that's another category.
So Daniel, let other people ask questions. Thanks so much, Cheng-Chwee. Daniel, can you field the questions off the Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Sansky. I'm the Deputy Director of the China in the World program. Our first question today is from Yvonne Chow. Some of these questions, this is a 4-part question, you actually already answered. So first question, with Malaysia's current economic capacity, will there be difficulties in repayment of the BRI project debt? Goes back to the debt question we just talked about. 2, how these BRI projects could help Malaysia attract foreign investment in the future and how important that is. And third question, what do you think of Malaysia's attitude as a recipient country in the BRI in the near future? And the fourth question, do you think BRI has a very clear intention, especially among ASEAN countries, should be aware of BRI functions as part of the exercises of China's soft power? And once again, this is Yvonne Chow. She's a first-year master's student in global business journalism at Tsinghua University.
All right. Thanks very much, Evan, for the good questions. So I think the first question about Malaysia's current economic difficulty. So I think my last elaboration answer to Tom's question I think provided partial explanation, in the sense that it depends on, it's a case-by-case and project-by-project basis. Those that are funded by investment, joint venture, I don't think, I'm not worried about the financial feasibility even over the long run. I think they would actually create a positive impact, development impacts. What is more problematic are those that are funded by loan, and also kick off in a very dubious background. There are 1MDB scandal related projects. So there were 3. I mentioned early on that the Mahathir came back to power and then he suspended that, right? So one is East Coast Railing, already renegotiated and then resumed. The other 2 are pipelines projects of similar nature. China pushed the envelope when the leader of the NEA, Najib, need China's bailout, and beggars cannot negotiate, right? So I think China pushed the envelope to its advantages. And if those issues were not suspended and resumed, and I would say suspended and renegotiated, I think we might see a debt trap in those three projects, but not others. So those situation, I think it's still evolving. I do not have an immediate answer to you, but I could tell you that the other two pipeline projects are being talked about before the second change of government in 2020. At the moment, I don't think things are going on, so it's still a big question mark. So the only case that I could answer your question would be ECRL after renegotiation. So I said that China made some concession. Among the concession is that the cost was cut by 1/3, that's one. And the other one also, other aspect also, China agreed to have more localization in terms of employment, in terms of resource mobilization. And more importantly, also China agreed with some suggestion put forward by the new government, at the time no longer new, but Mahathir Sepakatan Harapan government, in the sense that we want China play a different role. Earlier on, China only wanted to construct, build, and that's it. But we said that in order to make sure the long-term economic issue, China should be should share a stake in operating and running it, right? So China agreed. So now both sides, Malaysia and China, has been discussing about how to create economic spillover through TOD, transit-oriented development along the East Coast rail link stations, so that we could see this is a long-term infrastructure projects that is very expensive, heavy financial burdens on the part of government, any government. But through the TOD projects, hopefully some economic values will be created in the process, and that will take a long time. So that's first question, and that relates to the second question. How would that attract FDI? So that's why ECRL and Kuantan and also Port Klang that we talked about. Earlier on, we talked about very briefly about land bridge are important in the sense that it's certainly, and this is not necessarily China's vision, it's host countries' developmental plan. Malaysia's government, successive government, have always planned to connect the underdeveloped East Coast, but Malay majority states of Kelantan, Terengganu, and Pahang to the relatively better developed, more developed of West Coast. So the land bridge, all these Belt and Road projects came into picture nicely. Early on, it has been our long-term plan, but on ourselves, government budget is limited. We do not have the kind of financial means. So Belt and Road to some extent provided that, which is why when Mahathir suspended those projects, interestingly, even the Malay majority states in those East Coast, also those in the opposition, actually requested openly Mahathir government to resume the East Coast ruling, and that explained that there is a high developmental economic logic of once all these infrastructures are in place, we'll be able to attract foreign direct investment for a number of things that Malaysia thinks that we have comparative advantage. Of course, at the moment, elsewhere are looking into places like Vietnam and Indonesia and all that to a large extent because of the unprecedented political instability in Malaysia. You know, Malaysia has never changed government for 61 years, from 1957. After 2018, we changed government twice. We are seeing the third government, and I think in the coming months, we might see a different government with a possible election. So things are very unstable. That is the biggest problem that might undermine Malaysia's kind of appeal to a possible FDI. But over long run, if politically we are stable again, we do have all it takes to attract foreign direct investment with more integrated infrastructure. For example, our location at the center of Southeast Asia, at the center of Indo-Pacific region. And that's no coincidence that so many Chinese big players are choosing Malaysia as a place for their regional headquarters. Alibaba, for example, had been investing a lot in Malaysia through the digital free trade zone and all that. Right? Sorry, I forgot your third question, Daniel, if you could repeat again before I deal with the final question about the soft power part, right?
Sure, not a problem. The third question is, what do you think of Malaysia's attitude as a quote-unquote recipient country in the BRI in the near future?
Yeah, okay. I think that's an excellent question. And I think perhaps Evan realized that I actually didn't use the word recipient. I use the word host country or host government, because from our perspective, the word the recipient is too China-centric, too big power-centric. We are receiving, right? No, we are hosts. We are hosts. These projects are happening on our land, right? So we are not recipient, by the way. We are host country. Well, I think we don't say it openly, but I'm academic. I think I'm free to say whatever I want. But some governments, for example, as I said, in Thailand, they are the one who are very sensitive. They won't. I don't think they want to use the word recipient, right? Same for
Cheng-Chwee, the worst would be target, the target country.
That's right. So, so I guess the choice of words we use reflect our values and perspective, right? So, yeah. Thank you.
Sounds good. The next question comes from Asaf Ablagovich, who is a researcher at Heidelberg University in Germany. He asks, what types of projects or which particular aspects of the BRI projects are likely to be met with popular dissent, protests, or obstruction by populations in Southeast Asian countries? And then a related question, are there any detectable patterns in popular dissent, and how does it affect the asymmetry and expression of agency of states?
Okay. Excellent questions. I think Asha, right? You probably have an answer already, because those that are kind of not transparent would involve a high prospect of debt trap because of a big chunk of loan, and those that are clearly, as I said, kind of elite, top-down, special interest driven, and there are some corruption issues involved. Those definitely would be among those that are kind of facing some popular resentment and also discontent. And we are seeing this in so many parts of the region, right? Some more so than the others. Laos, for example, I think, although, as I said, after 2016, the construction has been going very, very well, very smoothly. But again, there are a lot of things that are not being reported, but that's primarily because of the nature of the political system. There are issues related about, the concern about financial feasibility. Also, there are issues related to things that are going on during the operation and implementation, right? Settlement, for example, the land compensation. So all this, I think, there are the implication more by host countries' governance, ability of agency as well, and not so much about China. China, of course, would take advantage. If a host country, you're not doing your part by negotiating tough and right with China. China, of course, is human nature, would take advantage. If easier, they would push forward, right? And we also know that China, because of their own experience in China and dealing with the outside world, China has done a lot with power, to quote my good friend Dr. Niao Chaobing's favorite words, which I totally agree. China is very good in engaging power holders, but not stakeholders, right? So primarily in part because of the nature of political system back in China, but elsewhere, they're very good in engaging the political elites, especially those leaders, power holders of the day. Sometimes they ignore, for various reasons, actors and also stakeholders outside of government. For example, other elites, for example, NGOs, for example, the local people who have a stake, for example, small SME, right, small and medium enterprises who are being affected by the big presence of China. So all those issues would be among the reasons that would determine the degree and also the forms of popular resentment and also domestic discontent. And the second part, it's about whether or not there will be certain patterns of what? Sorry, I didn't get it.
Second part was, are there any detectable patterns in popular dissent, and how does it affect the asymmetry and expression of agency of states?
Okay. Right. So I think it's a good question in the sense that on the basis of what I have just explained, here comes the importance of domestic factors, right? The legitimation, it's very important, and elites attitude. And the other one is about the governance that I mentioned briefly. Whether or not government elites would actually either aware of the seriousness of addressing the bottom-up sentiments, or they just ignore it. So I would, my own research indicates that the situation, the patterns is a mix. There are some who are more responsive than the others. For example, in a semi-democracy, a government like, for example, Malaysia, Mahathir 2.0, I think took that and of course for its own political reasons as a basis for winning over the hearts and minds of the people to increase his electability. But the political system allowed him to do that. In the so-called authoritarian countries like Cambodia and Laos, you would see a more problematic pattern in the sense that the elites might do that, but only perhaps superficially, nominally. But overall, you do see there are some responsive elements. Whether how strong, that's another story. Cambodia, for example, I do my and I, we actually spent some time in Phnom Penh, and then we actually took a trip from Phnom Penh, the capital, to Sihanoukville. Some say that it's becoming a China city or Chinatown because of Chinese construction everywhere, massage parlor, hotel and casino and all that. So, but we see a lot of things during that that trip. Before we went, we already heard a lot from even the elites, those within the establishment. So there was some resentment about like China's overpresence. And some went so far to say that China destroyed our Sihanoukville, something that important culturally, historically for many Cambodians. And we don't quite understand until we went there in Sihanoukville. It's like it's not even, I would say, we wouldn't have the feeling that this is like a city, not yet, because of it's a big, giant construction site. Constructions are everywhere, and all those issues, right? So we understand when why Cambodia, even Cambodian elites, they didn't say it openly, but in private conversation, they will review the kind of resentment. And then you read from newspaper that people generally also very, very unhappy about all these negative effects. But having said that, we also, on the day before we left, we got a chance to go through, there are two economic zone in Sihanoukville. One run by China, the other one by Japan. So Sihanoukville is interesting in the sense that from what we read from media, we have the impression that like this is like China dominated, but actually it's not. Cambodia quietly also plays some power game. Japan, things that Tom, we talk about Japan's role, right? Earlier on I mentioned about Thailand. Cambodia did it quietly. Japan has also in the picture. So the Sihanoukville port is actually still run by Japan. So Japan have a big role, but the one that we visited, the one run by China, we thought that is actually a very productive and a positive project in Sihanoukville, because of we were there, happened to be during lunch break. So we see thousands of Cambodian workers sitting around the factories, and you could see, is that disruptive? I think no. So Sihanoukville is interesting. You do see a mixed situation of some disruptive, changing the landscape in many ways, and create some speculative economic, not productive. But there are also some productive aspects that might help local economy in one way or another. So I hope I answer both questions. Yeah. It's a very long answer to your short question.
Very, very thorough answers. Next question is, there is some circumstantial evidence of Chinese troops in Boten. I'm wondering if you noticed this in your time there or had thoughts about the projection of Chinese security presence along with such infrastructure. There are incredibly valuable projects with Chinese citizens following along into countries with less stringent security and governments. Can you speak to expanding Chinese security presence into Southeast Asia?
One question?
One question, yeah, it's a long question, but it's one question.
All right, okay. So military presence, right? Did I hear Bhutan, or what is the country?
B-O-T-E-N.
So I knew that when it comes to a military presence, that has always been like a kind of a concern, and also to some extent perhaps a speculation as to what might happen, what might not happen. And it's not just in South Asia, in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. In Southeast Asia, I think the one example that has been on the news, it's the one in Cambodia, right? And Cambodian government elites have come out very strongly to deny and saying that Cambodia's law constitution would not allow that to happen. But this did not stop the same speculation or quote unquote prediction from happening. And I could also easily think of other possible parallel cases. And in fact, I'm still showing the map. You could see, I call this as like a Belt and Road map in Southeast Asia. And I call those railroad as the lines. And there are also dots, and dots refers to ports. So the lines and ports in Southeast Asia, Belt and Road related in Southeast Asia. So all those are kind of like important in the sense that from ASEAN countries' perspective, it's domestic development issue, political issue and all that. Over the long run, from a geopolitical, geostrategic aspect, it might change the geo-economic and geopolitical landscape. Maybe if all the things that we talk about right now and might happen in the coming years or decades are all happening, we might see one day, literally, all roads leads to Beijing. We used to say that all roads lead to Rome. Are we seeing things that all roads in one way or another will lead to Beijing? So railroad is important because of it will not, unlike other infrastructure projects, it's mainly concentrated on one single locality. Railroad is very different because of it cross. It's a pan whole country and cross border. So at some point, we are going to see that it will be like connecting the lines and connecting the dots. And would that, by that happen, would that be a military dimension? I honestly do not think that any one of us have the crystal ball to predict that. We would only say that I think your guess is my guess. It's possible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because China, just like any other powers, would take advantage if there is a space, a possibility to happen, right? And big powers expand is in their DNA, and it will be constrained and stopped or limited only if there are some countervailing power. So if other powers allow that to happen, I think that would happen. But if there are still constraining, and I believe they will be, and Biden and even I think what is going on right now clearly show that there are some form of balance of power taking place. But this balance of power is not necessarily taking place along what realists would emphasize militarily. I would say in a recent article, I said that big powers are competing, nothing new. But today we are seeing that the big powers are competing in two chessboards. The high politics military chessboard, but more and more also, I would say thankfully, from a Southeast Asia perspective, smaller countries perspective, thankfully more and more on the low politics infrastructure development chessboard. And what we are seeing, Tom, we talked about earlier on about the Quad's efforts, Japan and also US Build Act and EU's EU-Asia strategy. And I forgot to mention about something that I thought is also coming up in 2018, very interesting, in what is being labeled as the Blue Dot network. And Blue Dot network, it's among the Quad, across Quad. India is very late, the latest to come into picture. But during the visit, Modi actually agreed that India will play some part in one way or another. So all this, I think, is we need to understand it from balance of power perspective. Because China has grown so much in so many ways. That clearly countries are not comfortable for various reasons. Smaller countries are ambivalent in the sense that we welcome the opportunity, the developmental benefits. Right here, right now, put on table, we welcome that. But again, we are also worried about the long-term consequences, the so-called return of China-centric tributary system. Early on, it was okay because there is no such thing as the norm of sovereign equality. And China was the only power of the day, the only sun of the universe. It was okay. But this is 21st century. We have gone through a different stage colonization and all that. We do not certainly want any power to dominate so much that we are at the mercy of any power. And let me emphasize any power. But this is structural. It's beyond our choice. If there is no countervailing power in one way or another, without conflict, without Cold War style confrontation, I think we would quietly kind of welcome it. And I think China also, for its own interest, would welcome it. The fact that the third country cooperation formula that we mentioned about clearly shows that China is aware of financial and perhaps political sustainability of all these issues. So the more the merrier, the more crowded, the better, as long as we have more options on table.
Just one clarifying point real quick. The person who asked that question was actually asking about Bhutan in Laos, the city in Laos, not the country of Bhutan. I don't know if that changes your answer significantly.
All right. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So I do not have the detail to give comment, but I think the same logic applies. Yeah. Host country would use national law and all that to resist, but it all depends on what is the reality. If all the projects that you have with one power is dead and also resulted in dependency, and there is no other alternative partner that might help your leverage negotiation, then that's too bad. You know what is going to happen. But if you do have some political system that allow you to push back leverage, say that, look, we can't accept that, the people are going to vote me out in the coming election, China would think twice because they knew that all these involve a lot of money, right? And China also have the interest of ensuring that the projects will be sustainable. If they knew that it's not going to sustainable, they're going to stop and change in the next election, the next government, they would also have to think twice. I think they are learning a lot of a lesson from many other places. And that should be something that I think small countries can leverage. So what I'm saying is that it all depends on, I think, number one, the governance basis in the host country, right? And what extent elites are able to leverage on it to its benefit and also mutual benefit with China. Number two, also externally, right? Either the third country, third power actually provide some kind of alternative for host country to be able to find a solution that is good for everybody. And I do think that it takes multiple actors and powers to do that. And the more interrelated, the better.
Last one, okay?
Yeah, last question also from TK Chu, a longtime friend of the program. Two-part question as well, another longer one. Asymmetry has no inherent logic. Perhaps you mean that asymmetry does not lead to a predetermined course of action, as any symmetry generates a force. You point to the direction that the force is not known. This leads to a related question. What happens when there is symmetry? Does it necessarily lead to a Thucydides trap type situation?
Hi, Mr. Chu. Good to get your question after so many years. So the question is about asymmetry result in different patterns. I didn't quite get.
Oh, so Cheng-Chwee, I think what Mr. Chu, Professor Chu is saying is that your whole thesis is that asymmetry doesn't tell you enough. It just tells you a set of possibilities. But if you really want to know how asymmetry will play out, you need other factors. So it's not determinative. But he's asking, if asymmetry isn't determinative on its own, what about symmetry? Do equal powers have to end up in a Thucydides trap, or are there other factors that can either determine that that's going to happen or not going to happen? I think that's her. We've Mr. Chu and the program are old friends, and one thing I can say about Mr. Chu, he says he's an engineer, so he's thinking like an engineer.
That's right. So symmetry will bother much more, in many ways, right? So
I think is symmetry determinative? If asymmetry doesn't determine the outcome without these other factors, does symmetry determine the outcome without the other factors?
I think symmetry would be very much the core factor of power rivalries that we talk about, US-China relationship and all that. So again, I think things go both ways, as we learn from history. Some big powers, established power and rising hegemon, established hegemon and rising power, more often than not would clash with each other to Thucydides trap and all that. But we also learn from history that there are circumstances where there are conditions that allow the old and new hegemon to find some solutions to coexist or to pursue things that are being prioritized much more than that. So I can't predict what will go on for the contemporary symmetry between US and China. But from Southeast Asia's perspective, we do think that all possibilities all circumstances are possible. Actually, many of us in Southeast Asia, I would say Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, with remember 1824. That I think is a historical answer to your contemporary question, in the sense that 1824, what happened? 1824, we saw the so-called the Dutch-Britain deal. So two big powers of the day. The two powers were in war, in conflict so many times. But up to a point, after some rounds of conflict, up to a point, they have decided, let's not fight with each other. Let's talk and let's strike a deal to have a sphere of influences for ourselves. And that 1820 treaty between the two big powers of the day created the present day Malaysia and Indonesia, right? So I mentioned early on at the very beginning, Southeast Asia's history is a history of great powers. We remember that, and we do not know what will happen because of it might go to this direction, it might go to that direction. And these are all the risks of uncertainties that are back in our mind, not just Malaysia, but Indonesia and many others. US and China are now competing, right? Under a different leadership, they compete in different way, different chessboard, using different means, involving different layers of coalition, so on and so forth. We are ambivalent in the sense that we welcome the countervailing force. We want to leverage to our advantage. We would not support the Indo-Pacific. We would rather have our own ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific. But we would support and collaborate the different powers to our advantage. But we are also very nervous quietly that we might be entrapped by when this rivalry escalate into a military conflict. We will be the first to suffer, right? For example, China will attack us if we ally completely with US rather than say send a missile to Alaska or somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. We will be the easy target. In Chinese word, you say we will be the 炮灰, very quickly and very soon. It's beyond our control. And we are also worried on the other direction, right? What if the present day powers also strike a deal among themselves? We will be abandoned. And in fact, Malaysia, for example, remember the first 14 years of our history from 1957 to 1970, we were not hedging in any way, right? We were balancing. We put all our eggs in the Western basket directly with the UK through the AMDA, Anglo-Malayan, alignment, AMDA, Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement. But when UK, for its own economic domestic reasons, when it had to go, announced the East of Suez, they had to go. And suddenly we realized that we are on the own to face the communist powers, right? And that was the beginning of our hedging because we knew that power is uncertain. When you thought that you have someone behind you to back your back, to back you, but sometimes things might happen in a way that is beyond our, our wish or our expectation. So we need to be very cautious. And again, sorry, this is a very long, elaborated answer, but I hope it reflects some small state perspective why we seem to be doing things that are not so intuitive. Why we are hedging in different way. Although I didn't use the word at all early on, but I think this is the stories of hedging.
Thank you so much, Cheng-Chwee. We're so glad to have you back. Please come back more often. And thank you again for getting up at 4 in the morning or whenever you had to get up to get ready for this 6 a.m. talk. We really appreciate the sacrifice, and we learned a lot from you. And even though we're stuck in a pandemic, we can still have contact, and we hope that we have lots and lots of contact into the future. And we're hoping sooner rather than later in person with another conference for the former fellows. Thank you, Cheng-Chwee.
Daniel, for the opportunity, and this is clearly a great new experience for me. I think from now on, I can accept invitations for early morning talk. And definitely, I want you, Tom, you to get back to Kuala Lumpur again. Your last trip here is too short. I failed to get you durian hospitality. So we must do.
Well, it wasn't your fault. It was United Airlines' fault. It would have been a longer trip had United Airlines come through for me. So blame the Americans. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Good to see you, Cheng-Chwee.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Our next talk is going to be April 12th. If anything comes up between now and then, feel free to sign up for our newsletter to find out more information, and we'll see you all then. Thank you again to today's speaker, Cheng-Chwee Kuik, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.